At first, it didn't look like a collapse. There were no tanks in the streets of Moscow, no dramatic declarations broadcast to the world. The numbers simply stopped making sense. Markets hesitated. Currency traders paused mid-trade. Somewhere between spreadsheets and satellite feeds, a quiet realization spread: something foundational had shifted beneath the global economy. For decades, Russia had been treated as a paradox, rich in resources, heavy with history, yet often dismissed as economically fragile. But when pressure finally came, it didn't break the way many expected. Instead, it bent global systems around it. Energy prices rippled. Supply chains groaned. Diplomatic language hardened. And across Europe and Asia, analysts began asking an uncomfortable question: what if Russia's economic breakdown wasn't a failure, but a transformation? This story is not about a single crisis. It's about how sanctions, debt, culture, memory, and power collided, and how the aftershocks quietly rewired global influence. From trading floors in London to gas-heated homes in Berlin, from factories in Asia to policymaking rooms in Washington, the consequences were felt far beyond Russia's borders. Could this happen in another country too? And if it did, would the world recognize it in time? If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover hidden global truths. And tell us, where are you watching from? Long before headlines spoke of sanctions or currency crashes, the tension was already there, embedded deep in Russia's economic DNA. It lived in the uneasy marriage between a modern financial system and a historical instinct for self-reliance. On paper, Russia had integrated into global markets. Its banks spoke the language of international finance. Its energy exports powered entire regions. Yet beneath that surface, something never fully aligned. In the 1990s, the trauma of economic collapse left scars that statistics could never capture. Ordinary citizens watched savings evaporate overnight, while a new elite learned that survival depended less on markets and more on proximity to power. That memory lingered. It shaped policy. It bred suspicion toward foreign dependence, even as Russia continued to trade with the world. By the early 2000s, Moscow appeared stable again. Oil revenues flooded state coffers. Foreign investors returned cautiously. European economies grew quietly dependent on Russian energy, assuming interdependence would guarantee predictability. But inside the Kremlin, planners asked different questions. What happens when access is cut? What happens when trust becomes leverage? Those questions became policy. Reserves were stockpiled. Debt exposure was reduced. Alternative payment systems were quietly explored. None of this made headlines. To global markets, Russia looked like a conventional exporter riding a commodity cycle. But to those watching closely, it felt like a country rehearsing for isolation. Then came the early warning signs. Capital outflows accelerated. Western credit grew more conditional. Russian firms found borrowing slightly harder, then noticeably harder. Each friction was small, almost dismissible. But together, they hinted at a system no longer obeying the assumptions of globalization. In Frankfurt and New York, analysts noticed the anomalies but struggled to interpret them. Was Russia weakening, or preparing? The answer would only become clear when pressure finally arrived, and the global system discovered that one of its largest players had quietly rewritten the rules it was supposed to follow. The moment of rupture did not announce itself with panic. It arrived as a recalculation. When sanctions first tightened, the expectation across Western capitals was almost reflexive: isolation would force compliance, economic pain would translate into political change. It was a logic refined over decades, tested on smaller economies, reinforced by spreadsheets that assumed rational response and short memory. But Russia's response did not follow the script. As access to foreign capital narrowed, the state stepped in where markets retreated. Domestic banks were propped up, not to preserve investor confidence, but to preserve continuity. Trade flows were rerouted. Energy contracts were rewritten in currencies that once seemed peripheral. What looked like economic retreat from the outside felt, internally, like consolidation. Across Europe, energy traders began to feel the tension first. Prices moved in unfamiliar patterns. Long-term assumptions about cheap, stable supply suddenly felt fragile. In Asia, manufacturers watched shipping routes shift as Russian commodities sought new buyers. The map of global trade did not break, it subtly rearranged itself. Inside Russia, the narrative hardened. Economic pressure was framed not as failure, but as proof of external hostility. That framing mattered. It transformed hardship into endurance. Cultural memory filled the gaps where growth statistics once reassured. The economy slowed, but it did not fracture. Meanwhile, global institutions hesitated. Credit agencies downgraded. Forecasts grew darker. Yet reality refused to collapse on schedule. Russia's economy bent, shrank in places, adapted in others, unsettling those who expected a clean implosion. In Washington, policy rooms grew quieter. In Brussels, unity was tested by rising household costs. In emerging markets, leaders watched carefully, asking a question rarely voiced aloud. If pressure didn't break Russia, what did that say about the limits of economic power? The breakdown had begun, but it wasn't unfolding as breakdowns were supposed to. And as the world adjusted its expectations, a deeper shift was already underway, one that would soon pull multiple continents into its orbit. When the sanctions regime expanded, it was described as unprecedented, a coordinated economic offensive designed to sever a major power from the arteries of global finance. From the outside, it looked decisive. Assets were frozen. Banks were cut off. Trade restrictions multiplied. The assumption was clear: the longer the pressure lasted, the more inevitable collapse would become. Instead, something quieter happened. Across Russia, industries began operating under a different logic, not efficiency, but sufficiency. Production goals were adjusted. Imports were substituted, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes ingeniously. What couldn't be sourced was redesigned. What couldn't be replaced was rationed. It wasn't elegant, but it was resilient. Beyond Russia's borders, the shockwaves traveled faster than expected. In Europe, households opened energy bills with disbelief. Governments scrambled to subsidize costs, absorbing political strain in exchange for stability. In Asia, energy buyers recalculated alliances, negotiating deals that once would have seemed diplomatically risky. In Africa and parts of Latin America, leaders bristled at the idea that economic warfare between great powers could dictate food and fuel prices at home. Global markets reacted with confusion. Some investors fled risk. Others hunted for opportunities in volatility. Commodity exchanges became theaters of uncertainty, where every shipment carried geopolitical weight. The price of oil and gas no longer reflected supply alone, it reflected tension. And still, Russia did not unravel. Instead, it leaned into relationships that global finance had long treated as secondary. Trade with non-Western partners deepened. Payment systems bypassed traditional choke points. New routes formed, slower and less transparent, but harder to disrupt. Each workaround reduced dependence, and with it, vulnerability. What unsettled observers most was not Russia's losses, but its learning curve. Every restriction became a lesson. Every cutoff revealed which levers truly mattered, and which ones merely felt powerful on paper. As months passed, the question shifted. It was no longer whether sanctions hurt. They did. The question was whether pain alone could still dictate outcomes in a world no longer centered on a single economic gravity. And that question was about to become unavoidably global. As the standoff stretched on, a subtle fatigue settled over the global system. Sanctions were renewed. Restrictions were refined. Yet each new measure landed in a world already adjusting to disruption. What once felt extraordinary slowly became procedural, another line item in policy briefings, another variable markets learned to price in. In Moscow, the economy recalibrated again. State spending grew heavier. Military production absorbed labor. Civilian sectors thinned but did not vanish. Growth figures disappointed, then stabilized. The narrative shifted from recovery to endurance. It was not prosperity, but it was survival on Russia's own terms. Outside Russia, the consequences grew harder to ignore. European manufacturers faced shrinking margins. Farmers protested fuel costs. Central banks wrestled with inflation driven not by demand, but by geopolitical friction. In emerging economies, currency pressures intensified as global capital sought safety elsewhere. Diplomatically, lines blurred. Countries that had once aligned automatically with Western policy began hedging. Abstentions multiplied at international forums. Trade delegations traveled quietly, avoiding cameras. A new pragmatism took hold, less about ideology, more about access. analysts noticed a deeper pattern forming. The sanctions regime had not only targeted Russia, it had exposed how interconnected systems could fragment under stress. Financial networks, once assumed neutral, now carried political risk. Reserve currencies felt less absolute. Trust, it turned out, was also an economic asset, and it was being consumed. In think tanks and universities, debates intensified. Has economic globalization reached its limit? Could power still be enforced through exclusion alone? The Russian case refused to offer a clean answer, frustrating those who preferred certainty. And then came the realization that unsettled even seasoned observers. By forcing adaptation, the pressure had accelerated the emergence of parallel systems, slower, less efficient, but harder to control. What began as punishment was reshaping the architecture of global influence itself. And the final implications of that shift were only just coming into view. By the time the world began to articulate what had changed, the change had already settled in. Power no longer announced itself solely through growth rates or access to elite financial circles. It moved through redundancy, patience, and the ability to function outside the spotlight. Russia's economy emerged smaller, slower, and more constrained, yet also less predictable. The breakdown many expected had transformed into something else entirely, a system optimized not for expansion, but for resistance. That distinction mattered. It forced policymakers elsewhere to confront an uncomfortable truth: vulnerability is often revealed only under pressure. In Europe, strategic language shifted. Energy independence became a matter of national security. In Asia, financial planners explored settlement systems once considered unnecessary. In Washington, discussions turned toward resilience rather than dominance. The lesson was subtle but profound: interdependence could be weaponized from both sides. Culturally, the shift ran deeper. Within Russia, endurance became a narrative of identity. Outside it, confidence in economic certainty softened. The idea that markets alone could discipline states began to feel outdated, a belief from a more orderly era. For younger generations watching from afar, the message was confusing. If integration no longer guaranteed stability, what did progress mean? If pressure no longer ensured compliance, what did power look like? The global system did not collapse. It adjusted, unevenly, imperfectly, but permanently. And in that adjustment, influence became quieter, less visible, yet no less real. What lingered was not admiration or approval, but recognition. The rules had changed, and no single country was fully in control of the outcome. In the end, the most lasting impact was not measured in sanctions lists or quarterly reports, but in how nations began to think. The Russian economic breakdown did not restore old power or create a new empire. It revealed the limits of pressure in a fragmented world, and the resilience that emerges when systems are forced to adapt. Across the globe, policymakers absorbed the lesson differently. Some doubled down on self-sufficiency. Others diversified partnerships, wary of over-reliance on any single network. Quietly, financial architecture began to reflect distrust as much as efficiency. Redundancy replaced optimization. Stability became more valuable than speed. For ordinary people, the story felt distant yet personal. Higher prices. Fewer certainties. A sense that global decisions made far away could reach into daily life without warning. The invisible systems that once felt abstract had become tangible. History rarely announces when it turns. It leaves clues, in rerouted trade, in rewritten contracts, in the silence between once assured predictions. Russia's economic breakdown was one of those moments. Not because it shattered the world, but because it taught the world how easily systems could bend without breaking. And perhaps that is the quiet truth this story leaves behind. Power does not always vanish when it is challenged. Sometimes, it simply learns how to move in ways that are harder to see, and harder to stop. In the end, this story is not only about Russia. It is about a world discovering that the systems it trusted were more fragile, and more adaptable, than it ever imagined. Economic pressure, once seen as a final weapon, revealed its limits in a landscape shaped by memory, culture, and quiet recalculation. As borders harden and networks multiply, the global order drifts away from certainty toward something more complex, more human. And in that complexity lies a reminder: history doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it shifts softly, and only later do we realize how completely the balance has changed.